portfolios for the Greens, including social and community services and transport. Janet was a councillor of the City of Melbourne from 2003 to 2008, including a year as Mayor in 2006, and was Chair of the Metropolitan Transport Forum for most of her time on Council. She was also a recipient of the MAB Fellowship. I presume that was an award?
Yes.
Yep, award. During that time, which enabled her to undertake a study tour on community attitudes to sustainable transport and planning across North America and Northern Europe. Janet worked as a transport planner at the City of Hume after a time on Council and authored the Hume Integrated Land Use Strategy and Transport Strategy in 2011 and 2020. Janet's experience has provided her with an understanding of the workings and culture of government, particularly local governments, to critically review it and opportunities for achieving better transport outcomes. And we need this because the local governments can and must play a critical role on their own or in partnership with other local governments and the state government in reducing car use and car dependency, supporting public transport and most importantly, facilitating and promoting active transport. So please welcome Janet.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's the first session I've spoken on transport for quite a while. I finished up the transport portfolio with the Greens a couple of years ago. I've been out of the Senate now for 6 months. So I want to start by acknowledging that we're on the lands of the Wurundjeri people and to pay my respects to them, to all First Nations peoples, to Wurundjeri elders, past and present, and to thank them for their ongoing custodianship of the land, and to really centre ourselves in knowing this is, always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and everything we're doing, whether it's transport planning for the future of our planet, we've got to put First Nations justice at the heart of all of that. So doing more with less, and I mean it's blindingly self-obvious that that's what we need to be doing. We are massively overshooting planetary boundaries. We're in a climate crisis. We're in a biodiversity crisis. It's so obvious that that's if humanity is to have a future, we have to be doing more with less. But in good news, it's actually blindingly obvious what we need to do in terms of transport and infrastructure, of how to get people and goods around both the cities and the regions more efficiently. With less infrastructure, less energy, less carbon, less money needed per journey. I mean, I reckon that what we need to do can be summarised in 4 pretty simple points. The first one is getting a lot more people out of their cars for trips, whether they are electric vehicles or not, and particularly those trips that are only got 1.1 person per car in peak hour. So, you know, there's the low-hanging fruit of the people that you can get out of their cars. Second point, we need to shift an awful lot of those trips onto public transport and onto active transport. For all the time I think that I was on council, and since then I thought, I reckon a mode share of about a third car transport, private car transport, a third public transport, a third active transport, be quite achievable for Melbourne, and would enable people who do need their cars for whatever reason to get around. Yep, there's still cars in that mix, but you know, as a rough rule of thumb, I reckon that one third would work pretty well.
That's about the mode share in the Netherlands.
Yeah, it's right. Very achievable. The third point, we need urban planning that leads to fewer and shorter trips and makes public transport, walking and cycling more attractive and convenient for people for these trips. And the fourth point, getting onto freight, we need to be shifting long-haul freight to electric rail and road routes, and with trips powered by 100% renewable energy, very easy with, you know, our abundant renewable energy that we have in Australia, and then using zero carbon last mile deliveries to get the freight from those long-haul routes into people's homes and shops. So it's easy, and you know, the transport and planning boffins in the room and the campaigners in the room, they can tell us all what are the most efficient, what are the best public transport networks and freight modes. The local government experts and the active transport campaigners can tell us what's needed in infrastructure, what's needed in activities and programs to encourage walking and cycling and scooting. You know, it's pretty, easy to work out. But we've been saying this for decades. As Roger said in his introduction, I was elected to Melbourne Council 21 years ago, 2003. I was chair of the Metropolitan Transport Forum for most of my 6 years on council, and that 15 to 20 years ago. We were saying all of this stuff then. I wrote a wonderful transport strategy for Hume City Council. 12 years ago, I became the Greens' federal transport spokesperson and used the Parliament to campaign and advocate for sustainable transport, doing things like having Senate committee hearings on toll roads, asking questions and estimates about the total lack of a national cycling strategy, doing the stuff, everything that I could be doing to get the focus on the need to be achieving more sustainable transport. The lack of delivery on sustainable transport hasn't been because of a lack of ideas about what we need to do. The problem has been the total lack of political will to achieve them. And meanwhile, of course, the proponents of the excessive, doing less with more, wasteful, expensive, carbon-guzzling road infrastructure to accommodate cars being driven with 1.1 occupants in them, they aren't being asked to do more with less. I mean, I want to ask some questions. Over the next 20 years, who expects that in our growth areas, the single-lane arterial roads in the outer suburbs are going to be duplicated?
Definitely.
Yep. Who expects that the outer metropolitan ring road will be built?
Yep.
And I mean, it's baked into the planning scheme.
Yep.
Who expects that the east-west link will be built? Noting that the west-east part of it is currently being built with massive cost overruns and blowouts.
Yep.
Yep. And who expects that the north-east link will be completed despite, again, the massive cost overruns, the financial, the environmental and the climate cost? So basically the expectation in our society, and certainly amongst you in the room, that we're going to continue the decades of making Melbourne very extremely convenient and comfortable for cars, despite the costs of doing so. On the other hand, who expects that in the next 20 years we are going to see a transformational, all-day, fast, frequent, connected grid of public transport and safe, connected, active transport infrastructure? Who expects that that will also be built, let alone prioritised?
We can hope.
We can hope and campaign, but we're going to have to see some pretty significant change for that to occur.
Yeah.
I mean, as Roger said, yep, we're likely to have some signature projects, the big build being built. We'll have the Metro Rail tunnel, obviously, that's going to be opened. We might even get Airport Rail one day. Whether we get the suburban rail link, I mean, surely the costs of that project are going to come home to bite it. But, we will have some of those big signature projects. But we are going to be miles away from achieving, on the current planning and the current level of political will for sustainable transport. We are not going to get that integrated network of quality infrastructure and service that would enable active and sustainable transport to fully realise their potential of getting people around our cities.
Can I just ask a question? I've come in today on the line from Donnybrook, which is an outer northern metropolitan, developing a state area. Now the plans there for transport, for road duplication doesn't exist for the next 10 years. So we're just doing battle on every front, as many outer developments are. Councils, Reading Agency that we're under, have all these wonderful plans that they develop, and you go along to the focus groups and you say your piece and you push. It's all words.
Yeah.
How do we get the action?
That's what I'm about to get to. Basically, we need to have political will. Because otherwise, all we're going to get is just sort of crumbs. We're just going to get ongoing and meant to feel grateful for the crumbs that we're getting. I mean, I'm not criticising doing more with less. I think it's what we need to be doing. And if we're only getting crumbs, well, then it makes sense for us to make sure that we do our best to, smoosh all those crumbs together into as nutritious a loaf as possible. But even the projects that only cost crumbs, they're not being delivered. I mean, I can name any number of projects that are cost efficient, that are, on every criteria, are doing more with less, that aren't being developed. I mean, the fantastic Better Buses campaign across Western Melbourne. Yes, the Better Buses people down the back there. I mean, they're not asking for a network of tram routes like exist across the eastern suburbs. We're not asking for, massive expansions to the rail network, just a really efficient grid of bus infrastructure that would enable people to be getting across the western suburbs and throughout Melbourne efficiently and effectively on public transport. But the state government still isn't biting, even though it is an incredibly cost-efficient project. Building bike infrastructure. You can build 1,000 kilometres of bike lanes for the cost of building 1 kilometre of tollway or motorway. Yet one reason that the ACT Greens have recently walked away from being in government in the ACT and are now sitting on the crossbench was because they could not convince the Andrew Barr Labor Party to invest more in active infrastructure. I mean, Canberra is known for its cycling paths, and yet they are actually rather disconnected. I've been spending, obviously I had my 10 years of being a senator and moving backwards and forwards from Melbourne to Canberra, and over the last few months I have been spending quite a bit of time in Canberra because my partner lives there, driving and riding bikes, and I can tell you that bikes are very definitely the poor cousins when it comes to the Canberra and the ACT infrastructure. So what
they at least have them on the front of buses, which
they do. They at least have them on the front of buses.
Why don't we have
Well, exactly. Why don't we have them on the front of buses? I mean, what I want to do is to challenge that we've got to resign ourselves to only making do with crumbs. And when I started giving speeches like this 20 years ago, I said we needed political will to deliver the transformational public and active transport. And I still think, and I still absolutely believe that what's needed is that political will. But I've learnt a lot in 20 years, and I've learnt that political will is very easy to aim for, but actually really hard to get out of governments who are even more beholden to the road lobby, to the road builders, to Transurban, to the fossil fuel industries, to the development industry in particular, than I ever thought was possible back in 2003. We have political parties who are very risk averse, and they don't want to upset the right-wing media, or they don't want to challenge or try and educate currently car-dependent voters that other ways of getting around are possible. I mean, I knew back then that it wasn't enough just to show Labor and Liberal that the evidence that public transport and active transport made sense socially, economically and environmentally. I knew that it wasn't the case. A lot of people, when they first get into doing campaigning, they think if only we could show the decision makers the evidence and they would realise, yes, the scales would fall from their eyes. I knew back then that that wasn't the case. That wasn't going to be enough. But back then, part of me was still naively optimistic along the lines of saying that we've got to do more with less, that if we could get the stars to align on their terms, show them the evidence that massive new tollways are massively, extraordinarily and exceptionally expensive, whether that's being through the government investment or putting the cost of the tolls onto the public over the coming decades, or that bus networks are cheap, and that getting more people walking and cycling was going to be really good for health outcomes. If only we could massage our arguments to meet their terms, that then there would be the political will to deliver on these exceptionally efficient, incredible value for money, zero carbon projects. But no. 20 years has convinced me actually what I've always known, that we're only going to win through massive community campaigning and political power. That there's governments that are inherently risk averse. We have to demonstrate that the risk politically to them is far higher to continue on business as usual, and that the low risk thing to do is actually to deliver on the public and active transport and on the efficient transport projects. I mean, have a think of the wins that we have had over the last 20 years. I mean, why did the Andrews Labor government scrap the East-West link and pay out $1 billion in compensation, despite having to do that? It was because of a huge campaign, and it was because of the threat of losing inner city seats to the Greens. Which councils have delivered on terrific bike infrastructure? It's those that have had political champions. Of all shapes and sizes. I'm not just saying it's only Greens, but there have to have been political champions who have persevered, who have battled the road engineers and fought tooth and nail to get money in the budget and to take road space away from cars. I was travelling home from dinner just a couple of nights ago from Yarraville to Footscray. We'd been celebrating my youngest kid's 30th birthday, which is a bit scary to have 2 kids who are now over 30. And earlier in that evening, I had been to the swearing in of the new Melbourne Council, where we now have 3 Greens on council, 3 Labor and a Progressive Independent. And so John and Leon and I were reminiscing about my time on council when they were primary age kids and used to love going along to council dinners with me. And I pointed out as we travelled home a bit of separated bike lane that I had fought bloody hard to get in place. And I recalled winning the battle with the road engineers who told me, oh no, you can't have a bike lane there. You can't have a bike lane that goes around a corner. And I said, bloody hell you can. But it was a battle and I needed to be there and, you know, absolutely convince them. And I was very hopeful. I was very positive on Wednesday night that the makeup of our new council at Maribyrnong is going to mean that there are going to be some many more wins like that over the coming 4 years. And I think about the Better Buses campaign in the western suburbs, campaigning for a transformational, fast, frequent public transport system, an all-connected grid across the west. That's going to win. And it's going to win not just because they're doing more with less, but it's going to win because of the campaigning on the ground. And it's going to win because of the threat of Labor losing seats to the Greens in the western suburbs. And I thoroughly recommend that people get behind a campaign to help make it win. So I want to leave you with the conviction that transformational change in our public transport and our active transport networks that will enable us to do more with less in terms of people getting around, it absolutely is possible. But it's not going to just fall in our laps because of the analysis of how efficient and how effective it is. It's going to be achieved through people power and political power, as will broader action for a safe climate future, getting out of fossil fuels and building a just and fair society. And that just because we haven't achieved it yet doesn't mean it won't and it can't happen. What we've got to do is look at why we haven't achieved change yet, work out the strategies for change, and particularly getting that huge movement of people together to achieve change. And it can be a change by people working together to achieve that change. That's what gives me hope to keep on campaigning with you all for that better, brighter future that we're all looking forward to. Thank you.
Thank you.